Now to kind of replace, or really summarize what I think is important, which is science is a powerful transforming agent in culture. It's a powerful inspirational source for art and a powerful subject for artists. Scientists need to communicate effectively to several audiences. Arts cross science is a very powerful place to inhabit. It's an underutilized nexus of power for both art and science. Students of the arts and sciences should seek out each other's expertise. And then here's a very old screen that's got our funding agents on it. I'll have to get the new version of that before I give the talk publicly. But at least I have a placeholder for it. That's it. Thank you very much. And 47 minutes. That's good. I meant 45 minutes long. Questions? Statements? Yes?
So I'm curious about the choreography of images and sound, something I don't know anything about, but like it struck me when you were playing the Julia set how well the soundtrack matched the graphics when things pulsed in and out, so did the sound. Can you tell us about that process?
Yes, I can.
Clearly you didn't just put a soundtrack behind your movie.
I didn't take my favorite rock soundtrack.
Right. How does that happen? Which one comes first?
It actually happens in a variety of ways, and that also is true of the VR work. You notice there's very powerful and straightforward correlations between what was happening in the images and what was happening in the sound. All three pieces that I showed actually use different techniques, and I'll describe them. But first of all, I would like to compliment EVL on the quality of its sound. I haven't heard sound that good since Cal IT2. Every other place I play this stuff, it comes out, if you're lucky, through little computer speakers or something, because they never get house sound to work, etc., etc. On the image front, there's some processing going on between my screen and that screen, but I think basically it was just bumping up contrast and making all the artifacts of the compression technology visible. So it was slightly less. I decided to let it go, partially because the higher contrast is nice too, nice higher contrast in color, but there was a lot of kind of digital artifacts. But now, getting back to your question, is that, well, Spiral 5 was Spiral 5. There were 4 spirals before Spiral 5, all of which were performed live before audiences where the musician was jamming at the same time. So we had performance-oriented instruments. And basically, the method was rehearsal. You had ideas, you explored those ideas, the musicians were there, you rehearsed, you jammed, you rehearsed, you jammed, until you got a thing that was together. And that became the basis for the sound correlation. Now in this case, the sound was, we did it before a studio audience with a partial soundtrack, and then the soundtrack was conformed later. Part of the reason we did that is that we found public performance and crowd handling and all of that stuff to kind of interfere with our ability to do more careful work, take multiple takes, for instance. So one of the reasons I show Spiral 5, I show Spiral 3 too on occasions, but I mostly show Spiral 5 is that it was a better crafted work. It was better crafted because we were before a studio audience and we keep doing the takes until they started to get worse and then we stopped. And there was a soundtrack that was related to the one you saw, but then the sound person, taking the same attitude, reconformed their ideas to the existing visuals. So that was Spiral 5. What was the next one I showed? Oh, the next one I showed, the soundtrack was done entirely after the visuals were done. In that case, I was going to work with the same musician I worked with in Particle Dreams and other works that I've been a musician that I've worked with for a number of years, but I was just too late coming up with the finished visual work, and I really only had it done about a week before showtime, and it was originally shown, by the way, in 4K by 2K with 22 channels. Basically when I showed up with it, the music people there, and they have the Cal IT2 has a very strong kind of music component, handed it over to their students and let a group of them work out soundtracks for it. And this one was selected to be shown. So in that case, it was the student had a couple of weeks to work with the finished visual work and conform the soundtrack to it. In the case of Particle Dreams, there was an iterative activity going on, which is a way I've worked and like to work best, between the musician and the piece, where as I was developing particle dreams, I would send her videotapes of my kind of performing particle dreams. And she started to generate sound effects for that, which then were keyed off based on interaction activities. There's a kind of theme song idea. Each piece has a theme that is played at its beginning and repeats, and it's a kind of a drone track, but I think of it as a theme of the particular movement. And then a set of sound effects that are put on top of that are based on user activity. And so I worked iteratively. I sent videotapes of the state of the work, and she worked on sound pieces, which she sent back to me, and then I incorporated. And this went back and forth until the piece became somewhat refined. And then in the end, I kind of made the final decisions about what sound effects with what pieces, what human actions produced what effects and stuff. In the end, by essentially programming the sound at that point, what I primarily could do was, control the volume of the soundtrack so that, the amount of particles hitting a surface changed the volume of the sound, and triggers would initiate attacks on that. So I could control essentially attacks and decays and sustain levels, and they could be controlled in real time based on computation and human activity. So those are the ranges of things. Having good sound is very high importance. And in every case, I worked with a composer or musician to do it. And it was critical. Yeah.
Your first piece and your fractal piece. The first piece looked very similar. It reminded me a lot about the fractal stuff that you did. And was there obviously you didn't know about fractals when you first did your first piece, necessarily. But were you drawn to fractals because you were doing self-similarity kind of things?
I think I was drawn to mathematics visualization. I've always found mathematical forms to be very exciting and interesting. So fractals are a particular area there. I've also worked with Lou on visualizing topology and knots and other areas too. So I think it's really, the theme there is kind of mathematical visualization. I find the forms of mathematics to be, like walking in a new national park or something. There are these forms that are just so exciting and interesting. So that's there. And of course that was a linear spiral I was rotating. A lot of people think it was a logarithmic spiral. It wasn't. It's a linear spiral that forms that piece.
Let me ask you another question. When you showed the four-dimensional Julia set with John Hart's work, you could do the refraction of light or the reflection of light off the object.
And shadows and stuff like
shadows. The depth stuff was, you could not do the depth stuff without knowing the distances, I assume. And that came from your second student, forget his name.
Yumai Dang?
Yes.
No, actually, John Hart, what Yumai Dang did, she's a mathematician, what she did was to prove the distance estimation technique that John Hart and Lou Kaufman had kind of cobbled together was correct, was mathematically correct. Before that, it was just appeared to be correct because it generated the correct forms, but it couldn't be shown to be correct. So that's what Yumai Dang's thesis was about. So in all cases, with John Hart's method there, the way it works is you could imagine ray tracing a volume by throwing a ray through every pixel and then kind of calculating the intersection or stepping along, because you can't calculate the intersection with a fractal. You step along and iterate it, see if it disappears, step along, iterate it, see if it disappears. You can visualize a fractal that way, but it's computationally extremely slow because you have to take every voxel and iterate it to see if it escapes. What John Hart and Lou Kaufman brought to the table, what made it work as a visualization technique, was that you can estimate the distance to the fractal. It turns out it relates to the electrical potential of the fractals. What you do is you calculate, you believe you've charged up the fractal and you can calculate its electrical potential field because they are related somehow. And so you're able to get a distance estimate. It has an error, but you're able to do a distance estimate. So that you can take a step of typically half or three-quarters of distance estimate, iterate there and see if it escapes, get a distance estimate by the rate of escape, and then you can step again. So you have a fairly efficient way to render fractals. But you have depth information. You know the XYZ position of the surface. And then the second contribution was, well, how do you tell the normal? And so his second contribution was calculating normals by calculating the gradient at the intersection. So you hit the intersection, you make a little cube of 3 by 3 by 3, you calculate the escape times of each of those voxels, and essentially calculate a gradient from the escape time, because escape time is an estimate of how far away you are from the fractal. And so that you can calculate a normal and then light it. Now in this particular work, I did not calculate shadows, and I did not calculate the fraction. You can. My decision not to do it was for reasons of efficiency. And I was operating at very high resolutions. I was computing, because I had the anti-alias and stuff, I was computing at really 8K by 4K resolution. That was before I could use floating point, GPUs. And so I decided to give up shadows and reflections to get the work done, basically.
When you say you gave up on shadows and reflections, I assume you mean that you just cast one ray and didn't do secondary and tertiary rays from that.
Right. The code actually had it in it. I had turned it off. I also had some bugs with the code, which caused little things to happen. So it was a combination of compute time and debug time on the code. But I since debugged the shadows, which is the first level, the most important thing. The shadow stuff works. So the next work I do in this area, if I do one, will have shadows in it. And I do it on GPUs, which are of course like 100 times as fast. More questions, statements? Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.